Oh, church, I'm going to warn you, we're going to read a bunch of the Bible today. I'm really sorry about it. I tried to whittle it down to as little amount as I could, but it's like a bunch of slides. So I'm just really going to apologize. But because we're in the middle of our series on the book of John, and we've been looking at the Gospel of John, often called a book deep enough for elephants to swim, but shallow enough for children to wade. It's a book that meets us wherever we are going. We talked about kind of at the beginning that John tells us why he wrote this book. In chapter 20, he says, I wrote these things are written so that you will believe in Jesus as the Christ, God's Son, and that in believing you will have life in his name. So everything John is doing, he has layer upon layer upon layer of what he's doing, but the primary thing he is doing in all of that is trying to lay out a case to come and see who Jesus is, and in seeing who he is, recognize that he is God, he is the Messiah, and in doing that, experiencing a life, an abundant life at that. So really all that he does is in the name of that, but with that, he does layer upon layer upon layer of other things with it. To that point, we talked about in the first chapter that Jesus is given 7 titles. Over the course of the book, he makes 7 I am statements telling us about who he is. And then in his last group of 7s, Jesus gives us 7, or John points to 7 signs that Jesus is the Messiah. And we're going to look at the 7 signs today: water to wine, healing the sick boy, healing the paralyzed man, feeding the 5,000, healing the blind man, raising Lazarus, and the resurrection. But here's something interesting about John. Jesus does not do any miracles in the book of John. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those are often called the synoptics. Those are all miracles. Jesus does things like all of those, and we call them miracles. But for John, they're not miracles, they're signs. They point to who he is. But John actually critiques miracle seekers again and again and again. You believe not because you saw the signs, but because you ate and had your fill, he says after the feeding of the 5,000. Miracles, John's point to something, but if you're just showing up for miracles, you're going to be disappointed. You're going for the wrong reasons, and I want to reframe that. But I want to start briefly reading a little bit of each of the 7 signs accounts. Again, this is where it gets a little long, but I think they are worth it. Starting with water to wine. In John 2, now standing there were 6 stone jars of water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they took it, and when the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called to the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now. Hi, buddy. Next, in John 4, the healing of the sick boy. Jesus said to him, go, your son will live. And the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started on his way. As he was going down, his slaves met him and told him that his child was alive. So he asked them the hour when he began to recover. And they said to him, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. And the father realized that this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. So he himself believed along with the whole household. Now this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming to Judea and Galilee. Thank you, buddy. Third, healing the paralyzed man. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there for a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? The sick man answered, sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone steps down ahead of me. Jesus said to him, stand up, take your mat, and walk. At once the man was made well, and he took his mat and began to walk. Feeding of the 5,000. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people? And Jesus said to him, make the people sit down. Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. John 9, healing the blind man. When he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. When he went and washed, he came back and was able to see. Raising of Lazarus, John 11. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and the stone was lying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, Already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Jesus looked upward to heaven and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe you sent me." And when he said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The resurrection's a little funny because it's like 4 or 5 chapters, right? Like it's a big chunk. So we're going to do Jesus talking about his resurrection as a little bit of a breaking of my own rule. "I have said these things while I am still with you, but the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. I do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. You have heard me say to you, I am going away, and I am coming to you. If you loved me, you would receive that I am going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I. And now I have told you this before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe." Just need some water, not an illustration. So that was a bunch of texts. Sorry. Seems weird to talk about the 7 signs and not read them. As I was reading them this week, something hit me for the first time. It's something I've read the 7 signs of John like a bunch, but maybe not just one after the other after the other. And do you know what struck out to me? In John, a sign is only experienced if the person believes that it already happened. Every single time. That means that the nasty water doesn't become wine until it's handed to the steward. The boy is healed, but it isn't known until the father leaves and a day later finds out that it happened. The man can't stand up until he just believes that he's able to, picks up his mat, and walks out. The food isn't multiplied until it begins to be distributed. The man can't see until he leaves Jesus and washes his eyes in a pool. And Lazarus isn't raised from the dead until the stone is rolled away and the stench leaks out. Jesus isn't until he allows himself to be crucified. Book of John, and the others do this at some points and not at others, that every single time Jesus speaks, nothing happens, and then the person believes that it happened, and it does. And there's something interesting about that. I want to take us on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but first kind of name that in Mark 6, we see that Jesus can't do signs if people don't believe that he can. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are we not with his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him, and Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. There's something about Jesus that our belief seems to matter in what Jesus is able or willing or interested in doing. And that's something I want us to hold a little bit. But here's the rabbit trail, because belief in the Roman Empire wasn't really a thing. You could be a Jew and believe in Yahweh, or a Christian and believe in Yahweh and Jesus. But if you weren't Jewish or Christian, you did not believe in gods. You took their existence for granted. Obviously, there are gods, but it's not about belief. It is about power and protection. Obviously, gods are up there. No one's doubting that. But gods are not inherently morally superior to us, are not necessarily interested in us. The gods of Rome sometimes cared about us, sometimes didn't, often wanted to know what we would do for them. If they were in bad moods, they would do something to us. And that shaped everything that Romans understood about gods. It was not something you believed in. It was not something you put your hope or your faith and your trust in. Gods were fickle beings that if you played your cards right, would get on your side. And if you stopped playing your cards right, would not be on your side. Romans have been described really as using the scientific method to figure out what forms of worship are best. If you sacrifice a goat to Jupiter and go to battle and win that battle, you should try that sacrificing a goat business again. And if you do it again and you win that battle and you do that again and you win that battle, things start to show like we should sacrifice goats to Jupiter every time we want to win a battle. And so they start doing that. But if they start losing battles, even after sacrificing goats, they have 2 options. Change their plan, come up with a new system that makes Jupiter happy, or prove to Jupiter they didn't need him anyway, and they can trash his temple, melt down his statues, set fire to his altars, because gods are only worth worshiping if they are doing things for you. This is a really different framework than what most of us are familiar with in pretty much any world religion today. But it was this very empirical, if your God does things, then, honor that God. And if that God doesn't do things, then get a better God. In battles, Rome would show up to the town the day before the battle and do a ceremony to invite the gods to leave those temples and come join them. And if the gods didn't leave those temples, they would burn them down. And if they did leave those temples, they would build them better temples in their cities. So it's this very transactional framework. And that is what we have sitting in the water here. In a real good Roman religion, when you show up and say, I'm interested in you, Jesus, but I will not believe until you do this thing, for a God to say, or a person to say, just trust that it happened and go, is really countercultural. It's really not something that people would buy into. Not even Yahweh. Yahweh has a sacrificial system. If you want things to work and for Yahweh to be pleased, you do stuff a certain way. But this Jesus guy seems almost the exact opposite of that. Religious experts in Roman days would often be considered today like a bomb defusal expert. What they know how to do is make the bomb not go off. Doesn't matter if they like the government, believe in the God, care about it. They just show up, do their job, and bombs don't explode. Priests in Jesus' day showed up, did the sacrifices, did the rituals, and because of that, the gods did not get angry at them. Jesus is different. Jesus almost inherently resists our ability to ritualize things. You look at how he heals blind people. Sometimes he looks at them and says it and they can see. Other times he touches their face and they can see. This poor guy gets spit mud rubbed in his eyes. It's anti-ritual at every turn. Because Jesus is not interested in, can you appease me? Are you interested in doing this the right way? Jesus is interested in, are you willing to trust the words that I said? It's about belief. It's about relationship. It's about something beyond transaction. Gods were vending machines, and if you put in the right code, you got out what you wanted. And Jesus comes out of the blue, out of this little tiny town in Galilee, and is the opposite. So instead of that, we are again and again and again invited to trust what Jesus said and then see what happens because of it. We talked about a couple weeks ago that the invitation of the Gospel of John is, come and see who Jesus is. I'm convinced that if you look, you will see him to be who he claims to be. I think the same thing is happening with the signs. Not only look at the signs as the recipients of the signs, but as us, the reader, reading the stories about the recipients of the signs, we see that what we have to do is believe that Jesus is doing what he says he is doing, and then and only then do we experience the blessing of it. It's different. It's like a believe and receive, to be all cool and rhymey. If you want to experience the abundance of Christ, the healing of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, seeing the world with new eyes, not being worried about having enough, trust that what God invites us into is enough. And when we do that, things change. Now, just as brief aside, the prosperity gospel works very similarly. If you love God, you will be rich and powerful. This is not that. There's no promise in Jesus of wealth or power or fame or even the absence of pain or destruction or anything else. The promise of Jesus again and again and again is follow me and you will experience abundance. Follow me and you will be made whole. Follow me and you will become who you were always intended to be. Follow me and you will participate in being stitched back together with who God imagined you to be when he was knitting you together in your mother's womb. The promise of Christ is to become who you were intended to be, not to put the right chords into the vending machine to get the Reese's cups, because that's the best thing in a vending machine. So the invitation of the message is, if you want to experience God's blessing, whatever that might look like, do what Jesus tells us to do and believe that the blessing is already on its way. What does Jesus tell us to do? Well, John, I think, gives us 2.5 answers to that are really simple and incredibly difficult all at the same time. The first one, the primary answer to John of what Jesus calls us to do, love. Love God, love one another, love our neighbors, love our enemies, love the cosmos. That John 3:16, God so loved the world. We think of like the world as one word in all different places in Greek. In John 3:16, it's God so loved the cosmos, the everything. God so loved existence that God came down and became Jesus to bring existence back under God's lordship. So love. We at St. Thomas have a definition of love. It's every belief, behavior, or idea that heals or reveals the image of God in you or your neighbor, or the fingerprints of God on creation. So I think sometimes we get up and churches will preach like, just love people, or people will say, just love people, and we don't give ourselves a rubric for what that means. Love to me means I interpret the Bible how I want, and you have to interpret it that way, right? Or love to me means like whatever you want, I'll give you. But like, I don't always need another cookie, despite always wanting another cookie, right? So maybe it's not the most loving thing to give me infinite cookies. Any belief, behavior, or idea that heals or reveals the image of God in me or my neighbor, or the fingerprints of God in creation, becomes a litmus test that says love is not a simple binary thing. Love is something that is only discerned by looking at the fruit of our beliefs, looking at the fruit of our behaviors, looking at the fruit of it. If our neighbors become more whole when we believe the things we do, that sounds like a good set of beliefs. If we watch suicidality go up in our neighbors, probably a problematic set of beliefs and something we need to hold more honestly by looking at the fruit. If creation crumbles as we pursue our God, then there's something wrong with our understanding of love. If creation is restored and made beautiful, then there's something right in it. Love. Number 2, serve. Wash feet of those in your midst. Give up power. Serve those that need to be served. Raise those up by bringing yourself down. The promise of the Gospel of John is if you love and if you serve, the kingdom of God is made clear and apparent. We get to become participants in it. And the half of it, the 2.5 is, and ask God what God is asking you to do. Listen with ears open, because there are also these particular specific asks. Who are you called to love? Who are you called to serve? What is it that God is inviting you to do? I really feel at my core that God invited me to start this church with all of you incredible humans. I really didn't want to start a church. I made fun of church planters for like a long time. There's plenty of churches, just helpful, and then stinking Jesus made me do this thing. But there's this reality for each of us to decide for yourself. What does it mean to love your neighbor? By judging the fruit of it. What does it mean to serve? By giving up the things that you think you are owed for their sake. And what is God asking you to do? The promise of the signs is if we do those things and then believe that God will meet us in it, God will meet us in it. It's not a one-for-one. It is not a vending machine. Can you imagine being a dad that shows up to this guy who can theoretically do miracles? Your son is dying. It's apparently more than a day's journey back to your son. So you left your son while he was dying and walked a couple days to this guy, not even sure if your son is still alive. Then you talk to this guy and say, can you heal my son? Come back with me. And he says, just go a few days back and it'll be okay. And to believe that, I wouldn't. This man is remarkable. Because if I've walked 2 days and some guy's like, just head back, it'll be fine. I'd be like, no, why don't you just come? You know, I've got this really fancy sword here, and I would love to invite you along to see the collection. But the promise of John is if you just turn around and go and trust that it happened, it did. It's what we talked about last week when we are reframed into becoming people of abundance instead of people of scarcity. It's an unavoidable consequence of trusting that God is doing things for us. Not a vending machine, not always fun. Planning this was not always a pleasant experience. I will not plant another church ever. I know I said it before, but I'm really hoping I don't have to do that again. Take it back. I'll do whatever I'm asked, but please. Church, we can be a people that experience beauty by trusting that beauty can be experienced. How different can we move towards one another if we trust that God is going to meet us in it? If I know I can offer that thing because I'll be okay, it reframes everything. So may we be those people who love, who serve, and who listen to what we're called to do. Let's pray. Creator, meet us in all of it. Help us to see what you are inviting us into. Help us to trust that the words that you say are true. Help us to know when we try to weaponize the words we'd like you to have said versus the things you actually did. May we humbly hold space for your blessing. In your holy and mighty name, amen.